The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as tourists gathered behind the velvet ropes, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Karen Mitchell, a woman in her early 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer sunglasses perched on her head. She had flown all the way from California for this European vacation, and she expected everything to go exactly as she had planned. Karen pushed her way through the crowd. Ignoring the annoyed looks from other tourists, she was determined to get the perfect photograph, even if it meant crossing boundaries that others respected. Her husband Richard trailed behind her, quietly apologizing to the people his wife had shoved aside. He had learned long ago that trying to correct Karen's behavior in public only made things worse. The royal guards stood in their traditional positions, wearing their iconic red tunics and tall bearskin hats. Their faces remained perfectly still, eyes fixed forward, as they had been trained to do for hours on end. Among them stood Guardsman Michael Hayes, a young man who had served with distinction for 3 years. He took pride in his role and understood the importance of maintaining the dignity and tradition of his position. Karen spotted Michael and decided he would be her perfect photo opportunity. She ducked under the rope barrier, ignoring the signs that clearly stated visitors must remain behind the designated lines. Other tourists gasped and began whispering, but Karen paid them no attention. She was used to getting what she wanted. A simple rope wasn't going to stop her. She walked right up to Michael, standing just inches from his face. She waved her hand in front of his eyes, trying to get a reaction. When he remained perfectly still, maintaining his professional composure, Karen felt a surge of irritation. She was used to being the center of attention, and his refusal to acknowledge her presence felt like a personal insult. Richard called out weakly from behind the barrier. "Karen, honey, maybe you should come back now. I think we have enough photos," but his wife ignored him completely. She had spotted the perfect shot, and nothing was going to stop her from getting it. Karen posed next to Michael, making silly faces and peace signs while her husband reluctantly took photos. Other tourists watched in disapproval, some shaking their heads at the blatant disrespect being displayed. Security guards began moving toward the scene, but Karen was so focused on her photos that she didn't notice them approaching. When Michael still refused to react to her antics, Karen's irritation turned to anger. She had traveled thousands of miles and spent thousands of dollars on this trip. She felt entitled to the experience she wanted. In her mind, these guards were basically just performers, there for her entertainment. The idea that they deserved respect as real soldiers protecting an important historical site never crossed her mind. She reached out and grabbed Michael's rifle, trying to pose with it for a photo. This was a serious breach of protocol and security. The weapon was not a prop, and touching it was absolutely forbidden. Michael finally broke his stance, firmly but professionally removing her hand from the rifle and taking a step back to reestablish the proper distance. But Karen interpreted this reasonable response as a challenge to her authority. Her face flushed red with anger. How dare this young man, who she saw as nothing more than a tourist attraction, refuse to cooperate with her demands? She had paid good money to be here, and in her twisted logic, that meant everyone should cater to her wishes, without thinking about the consequences. Karen raised her hand and slapped Michael hard across the face. The sharp sound echoed across the courtyard, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The crowd gasped in shock and horror. Cameras that had been recording the scene captured every second of the assault. Richard stood paralyzed, his face pale with embarrassment and disbelief at what his wife had just done. Michael's cheek burned red, where Karen's hand had struck him. His jaw clenched, and his eyes flashed with anger, but his training held firm. He did not retaliate. He did not shout. He simply stood his ground, maintaining his dignity, even as his face stung with pain and humiliation. Other guards nearby remained in position, though their eyes flickered toward their fellow guardsmen, silently offering support. Security personnel rushed forward immediately. 2 officers grabbed Karen by her arms, pulling her away from Michael. She struggled against them, shouting about her rights as an American citizen and demanding to speak to someone in charge. Her entitled attitude hadn't diminished one bit. Even after committing assault in front of hundreds of witnesses, Richard finally found his voice and rushed forward. trying to explain that his wife didn't mean it, that she just got carried away, that they were sorry. But his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Everyone present knew exactly what they had witnessed. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of violence born from entitlement and disrespect. The security officers escorted Karen to a nearby station, while other personnel cleared the area and checked on Michael. A commanding officer approached him, asking if he was all right and if he needed medical attention. Michael assured him he was fine, though his face still burned and his pride was deeply wounded. He had endured 3 years of service, faced harsh training in difficult conditions, and never once had he been treated with such blatant disrespect. Karen was placed in a holding room. Still convinced that this was all a massive overreaction, she expected someone to come in, listen to her explanation, maybe give her a warning, and send her on her way. After all, back home in California, her connections and her lawyer had gotten her out of more than one uncomfortable situation. She had argued her way out of speeding tickets, returned items well past their return dates, and gotten managers fired for not meeting her impossible demands. But this wasn't California, and the rules here were very different. What Karen didn't realize was that assaulting a member of the Royal Guard was a serious criminal offense. These weren't mall security guards or hotel staff who would back down when faced with an angry customer. These were trained military personnel serving in an official capacity, and the law protected them accordingly. 2 police officers entered the room, their expressions stern and professional. They informed Karen that she was being arrested for assault on a military serviceman. They read her rights, explaining that she had the right to remain silent and the right to legal representation. Karen's face went from red with anger to white with shock. This couldn't be happening. She was the victim here, she told herself. She was just trying to have a nice vacation. Richard was allowed to see her briefly. His face showed a mixture of emotions, including embarrassment, frustration, and weary resignation. This wasn't the first time Karen's behavior had caused problems, but it was certainly the most serious. He told her he would contact the American embassy and find her a lawyer. But his tone lacked the reassurance she was desperately seeking. As Karen sat alone in that holding room, reality began to sink in. Her phone had been confiscated, her freedom restricted, and her carefully planned vacation had turned into a nightmare. Outside, the video of her slapping the guard was already spreading across social media, viewed by millions of people around the world. Comments poured in, almost universally condemning her actions and expressing support for the guard she had assaulted. The reaction she never saw coming had only just begun. Karen spent her first night in a police cell, something she never imagined would happen to her. The small room smelled of disinfectant and despair. The thin mattress on the metal bed frame offered no comfort, and the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed constantly overhead. She had demanded to speak with the American ambassador, a lawyer, and anyone else who would listen to her complaints. But her demands fell on deaf ears. The officers processing her case treated her with professional courtesy, but showed no sympathy for her situation. By morning, the video of the incident had gone completely viral. News outlets across the globe picked up the story. The headline read differently, depending on the source. But they all told the same basic tale of an entitled tourist assaulting a royal guard. Social media platforms exploded with commentary, and the overwhelming majority sided firmly against Karen. People expressed outrage at her disrespect, praised Michael for his restraint, and demanded she face serious consequences. Richard managed to secure a local lawyer named Margaret Foster, a sharp woman in her 60s who had practiced law for over 30 years. Margaret arrived at the police station with a briefcase full of documents and a realistic assessment of the situation. She met with Karen in a private consultation room, and her first words were not what Karen wanted to hear. Margaret laid out the facts clearly and without sugarcoating them. Karen was facing charges of assault on a military serviceman, a crime taken very seriously under the law. The incident had been recorded from multiple angles by dozens of witnesses. There was no question about what had happened. The only questions now were how the case would proceed and what punishment Karen would ultimately face. Karen tried to defend herself, explaining that she hadn't meant any real harm, that she was just frustrated. that the guard had been rude to her first by not acknowledging her presence. Margaret listened patiently, then explained that none of those excuses would hold up in court. Intent to cause serious injury wasn't required for an assault charge. The act itself was sufficient, especially when it involved striking a serviceman who was performing his official duties. The lawyer also informed Karen that the public reaction to the incident was making things significantly worse. Prosecutors would be under pressure to seek a strong punishment to send a message that such behavior would not be tolerated. The tourism industry was concerned about the incident damaging the reputation of visitors to the country. Government officials wanted to demonstrate that everyone, regardless of nationality or background, would be held accountable for breaking the law. Karen felt her world crumbling around her. She had always believed that money and connections could solve any problem. But Margaret made it clear that this situation was different. The evidence was overwhelming, the crime was serious, and the public attention meant there would be no quiet settlement or dismissed charges. This was going to court, and Karen needed to prepare herself for real consequences. Meanwhile, Michael returned to his duties, though the incident weighed heavily on him. His fellow guards offered support and solidarity. His commanding officers assured him that he had handled the situation with perfect professionalism. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation from being struck in front of so many people. While unable to defend himself, he had been trained to stand firm in the face of provocation. But nothing in his training had prepared him for the actual experience of being assaulted while doing his job. Royal Guard released an official statement condemning the attack and praising Michael for his composure and discipline. They emphasized that their guardsmen were serving military personnel who deserved respect and protection while performing their duties. The statement also noted that they would be cooperating fully with the legal proceedings against Karen and hoped justice would be served. Support for Michael poured in from around the world. Veterans organizations sent messages of solidarity. Fellow military personnel shared their own stories of facing disrespect while in uniform. Regular citizens expressed their appreciation for his service and their disgust at how he had been treated. A crowdfunding page was even set up to show support for him, though he politely declined to accept any money, stating he was simply doing his job and didn't want to profit from the incident. Richard visited Karen again, and their conversation quickly turned heated. He had been dealing with the fallout from her actions, fielding calls from family members back home who had seen the viral video, trying to manage the situation from outside the jail cell. He was tired, embarrassed, and angry. For years he had made excuses for Karen's behavior, smoothing over conflicts she created and apologizing on her behalf. But this time was different. He told her plainly that her actions had consequences, not just for herself, but for him and everyone associated with her. Their adult children had called, mortified that their mother's behavior was being discussed on national news programs. Richard's business associates were distancing themselves, not wanting to be connected to the scandal. Friends were sending awkward messages, unsure what to say. The life they had built was being damaged by her inability to control her temper and respect boundaries. Karen tried to blame Richard for not stopping her, for not supporting her more strongly, for abandoning her in her time of need. But her husband had finally reached his limit. He told her that he loved her, but couldn't continue enabling her behavior. He would help her through the legal process because she was his wife, but things would have to change. She needed to take responsibility for what she had done and face the consequences like an adult. The preliminary hearing arrived. Sooner than Karen expected, she was transported from the jail to the courthouse in handcuffs, something that felt surreal and degrading. The courtroom was packed with media representatives and members of the public who had managed to secure seats. Karen felt all their eyes on her, judging her, condemning her. For someone who had always loved being the center of attention, this was a nightmare version of that desire. The prosecutor was a stern woman named Catherine Reed, who had built her career on successfully trying cases against those who committed crimes of violence and disrespect toward public servants. She presented the evidence methodically and clearly. Videos from multiple angles showing Karen crossing the barrier, harassing Michael, grabbing his rifle, and then slapping him. Witness statements from dozens of tourists who had been present. medical reports documenting the redness and swelling on Michael's face, character statements from Michael's commanding officers attesting to his professionalism and service record. Margaret did her best to mitigate the damage. She acknowledged that Karen's actions were wrong and indefensible. She argued that her client had no prior criminal record, that this was an isolated incident born from stress and poor judgment, and that Karen was deeply remorseful for what she had done. She requested leniency, suggesting community service and a fine rather than jail time. But when the judge asked Karen if she had anything to say for herself, she made a critical error. Instead of offering a genuine apology, she gave what sounded like a carefully rehearsed statement that focused more on her own suffering than on the harm she had caused. She talked about how difficult the experience had been for her, how she never intended to hurt anyone, how she hoped everyone could move past this incident. Her words lacked authentic remorse, and everyone in the courtroom could tell. The judge was not impressed. He noted that Karen's statement suggested she still didn't fully grasp the seriousness of her actions or showed genuine understanding of the harm she had caused. He announced that the case would proceed to a full trial and Karen would remain in custody until then. Bail was set at an amount that made Richard wince, though he knew they would pay it to get Karen out of jail while awaiting trial. As Karen was led out of the courtroom, she caught a glimpse of Michael sitting in the gallery with other members of the Royal Guard who had come to support him. His face was impassive, but his eyes met hers for just a moment. In that brief exchange, Karen saw something that shook her more than anything else had. She didn't see anger or hatred. She saw disappointment and sadness that someone could treat another human being with such disrespect. That look haunted her as she was transported back to her cell, where she would spend several more days before Richard could arrange her bail. Richard posted bail 3 days after the hearing, and Karen was released from custody with strict conditions. She had to surrender her passport, report to a probation officer twice weekly, and remain within city limits until the trial concluded. The luxury hotel where they had originally booked their vacation had canceled their reservation, citing concerns about media attention and other guest complaints. They ended up renting a small apartment in a quieter neighborhood. Far from the tourist areas where Karen's face had become infamous, the apartment felt like a prison of a different kind. Karen couldn't leave without being recognized. Her face had been plastered across newspapers, television screens, and social media platforms around the world. Strangers shouted at her on the street, calling her entitled and disrespectful. Some people even followed her, recording videos on their phones and posting them online with mocking commentary. The woman who had always craved attention was now drowning in it, and it was destroying her. Richard spent his days managing their affairs from abroad, dealing with lawyers and trying to minimize the damage to their reputation back home. Their adult son, Jason, called one evening, and the conversation was painful. He told his mother that his workplace had become uncomfortable because colleagues kept bringing up the incident. His girlfriend's family had expressed concerns about being associated with someone who had made international news for all the wrong reasons. He loved his mother, but he needed her to understand how far the consequences of her actions had spread. Their daughter Amy was even more direct. She told Karen that she was ashamed and angry. Amy worked as a teacher, and her students had seen the viral video. She had spent an entire class period dealing with questions about why her mother had hit a soldier. Amy had to explain that adults sometimes make terrible choices and have to face consequences. She told Karen that she had unknowingly provided a perfect example of what not to do, and while that had educational value, it was humiliating for Amy personally. These conversations broke something inside. Karen, she had always seen herself as a good mother, a successful woman, someone who stood up for herself and didn't let others push her around. But now her own children were telling her that her behavior had hurt them deeply. She began to realize that what she had always framed as strength and assertiveness looked very different from the outside. It looked like entitlement, disrespect, and cruelty. Margaret visited Karen at the apartment to discuss trial strategy. The lawyer was frank about their chances. The evidence was overwhelming, and public sentiment was entirely against them. Their best hope was to demonstrate genuine remorse and hope for a more lenient sentence. Margaret suggested that Karen might benefit from speaking with a therapist who could help her understand the roots of her behavior and provide documentation of her efforts to change. This wouldn't erase what she had done, but it might show the court that she was taking responsibility seriously. Karen initially resisted the idea. She didn't think she needed therapy. She had just made one mistake, she told herself, one bad moment that had spiraled out of control. But Margaret pressed her, explaining that the pattern of behavior displayed in the video suggested deeper issues. The way Karen had ignored boundaries, dismissed the guard's humanity, and felt entitled to treat him as a prop for her entertainment. All pointed to problems with empathy and respect for others. If Karen wanted any chance of a better outcome, she needed to confront these issues honestly. Reluctantly, Karen agreed to see Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a psychologist who specialized in behavioral issues and anger management. Their first session was uncomfortable. Dr. Morrison didn't coddle Karen or accept her excuses. She asked direct questions about Karen's life, her relationships, her patterns of behavior in other situations. Karen found herself describing incidents she had never thought much about before. Arguments with service workers who didn't meet her standards. Conflicts with neighbors over minor issues. Times when she had demanded special treatment and become angry when refused. As Karen talked, patterns began to emerge that she had never recognized. She realized that she often treated people in service positions as less than human, as obstacles to overcome or tools to use, rather than as individuals deserving of respect. She thought back to how many waiters she had reduced to tears, how many customer service representatives she had demanded to speak with supervisors over trivial matters, how many times she had used her money and status to bully others into compliance. Dr. Morrison helped Karen see that her behavior stemmed from deep insecurity and a need to feel powerful. Karen had grown up in a family where money equaled worth, where being served meant being important. She had internalized the message that her value came from her ability to get what she wanted, when she wanted it, regardless of how it affected others. The incident with Michael wasn't an isolated event. It was the inevitable result of years of unchecked entitlement finally crossing a line that couldn't be ignored. This realization was painful and difficult. Karen spent several sessions crying, confronting the reality that she had hurt many people over the years and never truly considered their feelings. She thought about all the workers she had gotten fired for not meeting her impossible demands, never considering that they had families to support. She remembered the times she had humiliated people in public to make herself feel superior, never thinking about the lasting impact of that humiliation. Meanwhile, the trial date approached. Margaret prepared her case, focusing on presenting Karen as someone who recognized her wrongdoing and was actively working to change. She gathered documentation from Dr. Morrison about their therapy sessions and Karen's progress. She prepared character witnesses who could speak to Karen's better qualities, though finding people willing to testify on her behalf proved challenging given the public nature of the scandal. On the other hand was dealing with his own complicated emotions. He had received overwhelming support from the public and his fellow servicemen, but the incident had changed him. He found himself more wary around tourists, more guarded in his interactions. The trust he had once had in people's basic decency had been damaged. His commanding officer noticed the change and arranged for Michael to speak with a military counselor who specialized in helping service members process difficult experiences. The counseling sessions helped. Michael understands that what happened wasn't his fault. He had done nothing wrong. He had maintained his professionalism even when faced with assault. But healing from the humiliation and violation of being struck while unable to defend himself took time. The counselor helped him work through his feelings of anger, helplessness, and betrayal of trust. As the trial date drew closer, both Karen and Michael found themselves preparing to face each other again in court. For Karen, it meant confronting the person she had harmed and taking full responsibility for her actions. For Michael, it meant standing up for himself and demanding that justice be served, not just for him but for all service members who faced disrespect while performing their duties. Richard noticed changes in Karen during the weeks before trial. She was quieter, more reflective. She spent less time complaining about her circumstances and more time thinking about how she had gotten to this point. She wrote letters to people she had wronged over the years, apologizing for her past behavior. Most of them went unanswered, but the act of writing them was part of her process of accepting responsibility. One evening, Karen asked Richard if he thought Michael would ever be able to forgive her. Richard considered the question carefully before answering. He told her that forgiveness wasn't something she could demand or expect. It was something that might be given freely if Michael chose to offer it, but she had no right to it. What she could do was demonstrate through her actions that she truly understood the harm she had caused and was committed to becoming a better person. The conversation marked a turning point for Karen. She stopped thinking about how to minimize her punishment and started thinking about how to make genuine amends. She couldn't undo what she had done, but she could ensure that she never treated another person with such disrespect again. She could use her experience to help others understand the importance of treating everyone with dignity. Regardless of their position or role, Margaret was cautiously optimistic about this change. Genuine remorse and demonstrated efforts to change wouldn't guarantee a lenient sentence, but they were certainly better than the defensive, excuse-making attitude Karen had displayed initially. The lawyer prepared Karen for the reality that she would likely face significant punishment, possibly including jail time. But that how she conducted herself during the trial would matter both for the judge's decision and for her own ability to move forward afterward. The night before the trial, Karen couldn't sleep. She lay in bed thinking about Michael, wondering how the incident had affected his life. She thought about the split second when she had raised her hand and struck him, a moment of anger that had changed everything. She wished desperately that she could go back and make a different choice, but time only moved forward. All she could do now was face the consequences of her actions with as much dignity and honesty as she could manage. The morning of the trial arrived cold and gray, matching Karen's mood perfectly. She dressed carefully in conservative clothing that Margaret had suggested, wanting to appear respectful and serious. Richard drove them to the courthouse in silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what the day might bring. Outside the building, news crews had set up their cameras and reporters jockeyed for position. Hoping to capture footage of the woman whose actions had sparked international outrage, Karen kept her head down as they walked through the crowd, ignoring the shouted questions and camera flashes. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was solemn and official. The courtroom filled quickly with journalists, members of the public, and representatives from various military and veterans organizations who had come to show support for Michael. Karen felt the weight of all those eyes on her. Judging her before a single word had been spoken, the prosecution presented their case first. Catherine Reed was methodical and devastating in her presentation. She played the videos of the incident from multiple angles, each one showing clearly Karen's deliberate choice to cross the barrier, harass Michael, and ultimately strike him. She called witnesses who had been present that day, tourists who described the shock and horror they felt watching the assault unfold. Their testimony painted a picture of a woman who felt the rules didn't apply to her and who treated a serviceman with shocking disrespect. Then Catherine called Michael to the stand. He walked forward in his dress uniform, back straight and shoulders squared. He took the oath and sat down, his face professional, but showing the strain of the past weeks. Catherine asked him to describe the incident in his own words, and Michael spoke, clearly and calmly, about what had happened that day. He explained that remaining still and silent while tourists took photos was part of his duty, something he did willingly as a representative of his country and the military. He described feeling increasingly uncomfortable as Karen crossed the barrier and invaded his personal space, but maintaining his professional composure as he had been trained to do. When she grabbed his rifle, he had to respond to ensure the weapon remained secure, but he had done so as gently as possible while still being firm. Then Michael spoke about the moment Karen struck him. His voice remained steady, but everyone in the courtroom could hear the underlying emotion. He described the shock and humiliation of being hit while unable to defend himself, the burning pain on his face, and the struggle to maintain his composure in front of hundreds of witnesses. He talked about the aftermath, the supportive messages from fellow servicemen, mixed with his own complicated feelings about what had happened. When Margaret cross-examined Michael, she was respectful and gentle. She asked if he had recovered physically, and Michael confirmed that the physical pain had been temporary. But when she asked if the incident had affected him emotionally or psychologically, Michael hesitated before answering honestly. He admitted that the experience had changed how he felt about his duties. that he found himself more wary and less trusting of tourists. He said the hardest part wasn't the physical assault, but the dehumanization. The feeling of being treated as a prop rather than as a person. His words hung in the air. Karen felt them like physical blows. She saw clearly, for perhaps the first time, the real impact of her actions. This wasn't just about a slap. It was about treating another human being as less than human. It's about stripping away his dignity while he stood unable to defend himself. Tears began rolling down her cheeks. Genuine tears of remorse and shame. The prosecution rested their case, and it was time for the defense. Margaret called character witnesses who spoke about Karen's involvement in charity, work back home, and her role as a mother and community member. But their testimony felt hollow against the weight of the evidence and Michael's powerful statement. Then Margaret called Dr. Morrison to the stand. The psychologist explained that she had been working with Karen for several weeks. She described the therapy sessions and the progress Karen had made in recognizing the patterns of behavior that had led to the incident. Dr. Morrison testified that Karen had shown genuine remorse and was actively working to understand and change the attitudes and behaviors that had caused her to treat others with disrespect. She acknowledged that this work was ongoing and would require continued effort. But she believed Karen's commitment to change was sincere. Finally, it was time for Karen to take the stand. She walked forward on shaky legs, acutely aware that this was her only opportunity to speak directly to the judge and the court. Margaret guided her through questions about the incident, and Karen answered honestly. She didn't make excuses or try to minimize what she had done. She acknowledged that she had crossed the barrier deliberately, that she had harassed Michael, and that she had struck him in anger when he didn't respond the way she wanted. When Margaret asked why she had acted that way, Karen took a deep breath before answering. She spoke about her pattern of entitled behavior over the years, about how she had treated service workers and anyone in positions she viewed as beneath her. She admitted that she had never truly seen Michael as a person that day, but rather as an obstacle to getting the photo she wanted. She said the words were difficult to speak, but necessary to acknowledge. Then Karen did something her lawyer hadn't specifically prepared her for. She turned to look directly at Michael, who sat in the gallery. Her voice shook as she spoke to him directly, not as a performance for the court, but as a genuine expression of remorse. She told him she was deeply sorry for what she had done. She acknowledged that her apology couldn't undo the harm she had caused or erase the humiliation he had experienced. She said she understood if he could never forgive her, that she didn't deserve his forgiveness. But she wanted him to know that she saw him now as a real person, someone who deserved respect and dignity, someone whose service to his country should be honored rather than disrespected. She said she would spend the rest of her life trying to be better, to treat others with the respect they deserved, and to ensure she never caused such harm again. The courtroom was silent as Karen spoke. Some people watching were moved by what appeared to be genuine remorse. Others remained skeptical, wondering if this was just another performance designed to reduce her sentence. Michael's face remained impassive, though those who knew him well could see the conflict of emotions. Beneath the surface, the prosecution had their chance to cross-examine. Karen? Catherine Reed asked, pointed. Questions designed to reveal whether Karen's remorse was genuine or merely strategic. She asked about other incidents of poor behavior toward service workers. She questioned whether Karen would have felt any remorse at all if the incident hadn't been caught on video and gone viral. She challenged Karen to explain why anyone should believe she had truly changed after just a few weeks of therapy when she had displayed entitled behavior for decades. Karen answered as honestly as she could. She admitted that, without the public exposure and serious consequences, she might not have been forced to confront her behavior. She acknowledged that she had much work left to do, that a few weeks of therapy was just the beginning of a long process of change. She said she couldn't prove her sincerity with words alone, only with her actions going forward. The trial concluded with closing arguments from both sides. Catherine Reed argued that Karen's actions warranted serious punishment to send a clear message that assaulting service members would not be tolerated regardless of who committed the crime. She asked for a sentence that included substantial jail time, arguing that anything less would fail to deliver justice. Margaret made an impassioned plea for leniency. She acknowledged the seriousness of the crime, but argued that Karen had shown genuine remorse and was taking active steps to change. She suggested that a sentence focused on rehabilitation rather than pure punishment would serve both Karen and society better. She proposed extensive community service, continued therapy, and probation rather than lengthy incarceration. The judge announced that he would take time to consider all the evidence and testimony before issuing his sentence. He scheduled a sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later. Karen left the courtroom emotionally exhausted, a feeling that she had at least been honest about her actions and their impact. Whether that honesty would affect her sentence remained to be seen. Richard drove them back to the apartment in silence again. But this time, it was a more contemplative silence. He had seen a side of his wife during the trial that gave him hope. The defensive, excuse-making woman who had been arrested weeks ago had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely willing to confront her flaws and work to become better. Whether this change would last beyond the immediate crisis remained to be seen, but it was a start. That evening, Karen sat alone in the apartment thinking about Michael's testimony and the look on his face when she had apologized directly to him. She couldn't read his expression or know what he was thinking. She could only hope that her words had reached him on some level, that he understood her remorse was real, and that perhaps someday he might be able to move past what she had done to him. The 2 weeks between trial and sentencing felt like an eternity. Karen continued her therapy sessions with Dr. Morrison, diving deeper into understanding the roots of her entitled behavior. They explored her childhood, examining how growing up in a wealthy family had shaped her worldview. Her parents had taught her that money bought privilege, that people in service positions existed to cater to those with means. She had internalized these toxic beliefs without ever questioning them. Till now, Karen also started volunteering at a local community center that served low-income families. Margaret had suggested it as a way to demonstrate commitment to change. But Karen found it becoming something more meaningful than a legal strategy. Working alongside people from all walks of life, hearing their stories, and seeing their struggles helped her develop the empathy she had lacked for so long. The director of the center, a woman named Rosa, took Karen under her wing and showed her the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. One afternoon at the center, Karen met a young mother named Sophie, who was struggling to support her 2 children while working 3 part-time jobs. Sophie told Karen about being yelled at by a customer at the restaurant where she worked. Someone who had treated her terribly over a small mistake with an order. The story hit Karen hard because she recognized herself in that customer's behavior. She had been that person countless times, never thinking about the real human being on the receiving end of her anger. Karen asked Sophie what it felt like to be treated that way. Sophie's answer was honest and painful. She said it made her feel worthless, like her humanity didn't matter, like she was just a thing to be used and discarded. She talked about going home after shifts like that and crying, feeling degraded and questioning her own value. Karen listened with tears in her eyes, finally truly understanding the impact of behavior she had inflicted on others for years. That evening, Karen wrote in a journal Dr. Morrison had suggested she'd keep. She documented her conversation with Sophie and the realization that she had caused that same pain to countless people. She wrote about feeling ashamed but also determined to do better. The journal was becoming a record of her transformation, one small step at a time. Meanwhile, Michael was also processing everything that had happened. After the trial, several of his fellow guardsmen had asked him how he felt about Karen's apology. Michael admitted he wasn't sure. Part of him wanted to hold on to his anger, to refuse to let her off the hook for what she had done. But another part of him had been moved by what seemed like genuine remorse in her words and tears. He was torn between his hurt and his recognition that people could change. Michael's commanding officer, Colonel Andrews, invited him to lunch one day to discuss the upcoming sentencing. The colonel was a veteran of multiple tours who had seen the best and worst of human behavior. He told Michael that justice and mercy weren't opposites, but could work together. He said that whatever sentence the judge handed down, Michael should focus on his own healing and moving forward rather than on revenge or punishment. The colonel also shared his own story of forgiving someone who had wronged him during his service. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't happened quickly. But eventually he had realized that holding on to anger was hurting him more than the person he was angry at. The conversation gave Michael something to think about as the sentencing date approached. Richard noticed that Karen had changed in fundamental ways during these 2 weeks. She no longer snapped at service workers or demanded special treatment. She said please and thank you with genuine warmth. She made eye contact with people and asked about their days. These small changes might seem insignificant to others, but to Richard they represented a transformation he had never thought possible. One evening, Karen told Richard that regardless of what happened at sentencing, she was grateful for the experience. Richard looked at her in surprise, and she explained what she meant. She said that getting arrested and facing serious consequences had been the wake-up call she desperately needed. It had forced her to confront behavior she had been able to ignore for decades. It had pushed her to develop empathy and understanding she had never bothered to cultivate before. In a strange way, the worst thing that had ever happened to her was also becoming the catalyst for becoming a better person. Richard admitted that he had been considering divorce before all this happened. He had grown tired of making excuses for her behavior and dealing with the fallout from her actions. But seeing her genuine efforts to change had given him hope that their marriage might be salvaged. He told her he loved her, but needed her to understand that this transformation had to be permanent. Not just a strategy to reduce her sentence, Karen assured him that she understood. She said she couldn't promise perfection because changing decades of ingrained behavior would take time and ongoing effort. But she could promise that she would keep trying, keep working on herself, and never go back to being the person who had slapped that young guardsman for naught. Being a good enough prop for her photos, the day before sentencing, Margaret called with news. Michael had submitted a statement to the court that would be read at the hearing. She didn't know what it said, but she warned Karen to prepare herself for whatever it might contain. He had every right to express his anger and desire for harsh punishment. Karen told Margaret she understood and would accept whatever. Michael felt he needed to say. Karen spent that final evening before sentencing writing letters to her children. She told Jason and Amy that she loved them and was sorry for embarrassing them. She acknowledged that she hadn't been the mother they deserved in many ways, always focused on appearances and status, rather than on raising kind, empathetic people. She thanked them for being better humans than she had taught them to be, and promised to spend the rest of her life trying to be a mother they could be proud of. She also wrote a letter to Michael that she asked Margaret to deliver regardless of the outcome. In it, she thanked him for his service to his country. She apologized again for treating him with such disrespect. She told him about the work she had been doing to change and understand her behavior. She said she didn't expect forgiveness but wanted him to know that his dignity and humanity mattered to her now in a way they hadn't that terrible day at the palace. She hoped that someday, when he thought about the incident, he might be able to remember not just the assault, but also that the person who hurt him had worked to become better because of what she had done to him. The morning of sentencing arrived. Karen dressed carefully again and tried to prepare herself mentally for whatever would happen. She and Richard drove to the courthouse for the last time. The media presence was smaller than during the trial, but still significant. Inside the courtroom, she saw Michael in the gallery again, surrounded by fellow guardsmen showing their support. The judge entered, and everyone rose. After they sat back down, he began by reviewing the case and the evidence. He acknowledged the serious nature of the crime and the need for justice. Then he said he had received several statements he wanted to address before issuing his sentence. First, he read statements from military organizations emphasizing the importance of protecting service members from assault while performing their duties. They argued for strong punishment to deter similar incidents. Then he read statements from members of the public expressing various views on appropriate sentencing. Finally, the judge said he had received a statement from Guardsman Michael Hayes that he would read in full. Karen held her breath, bracing herself for words of anger and condemnation. But what the judge read surprised everyone in the courtroom. Michael's statement acknowledged the harm that had been done and the difficulty of the experience. But then it took an unexpected turn. Michael wrote that he had watched Karen's testimony and apology during the trial. He said he couldn't know for certain if her remorse was genuine. but something about her direct apology to him had felt real in a way that scripted words wouldn't have. He had learned that she was volunteering at a community center and working with a therapist to address her behavior patterns. Michael wrote that justice was important, but so was redemption. He said that as a guardsman, he served to protect people and uphold values like honor and mercy. While he believed Karen should face consequences for her actions, he hoped those consequences would focus on rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. He wrote that he had been raised to believe people could change if given the opportunity and support to do so. He said he would rather see Karen become a better person who helped others than simply see her locked away. The statement concluded with Michael saying that whatever sentence the judge deemed appropriate, he would accept and move forward with his life and career. But he wanted the court to know that he harbored no desire for vengeance, only a hope that something positive might eventually come from this painful experience. Karen was crying openly by the time the judge finished reading. She hadn't expected such grace from the young man she had wronged so badly. Michael's statement reflected a maturity and compassion that put her own behavior to shame and made her more determined than ever to prove worthy of the mercy he was extending. The judge set down the statement and looked directly at Karen. His expression was thoughtful and serious as he prepared to deliver her sentence. He acknowledged that assaulting a service member was a serious crime that could not be treated lightly. The evidence was overwhelming, and Karen's guilt was not in question. What remained was determining what form justice should take. He explained that he had reviewed all testimony, watched the incident videos multiple times, and considered every statement submitted to the court. Cases like this required balancing punishment, deterrence, public safety, and rehabilitation. Each factor mattered, but they pointed in different directions. The judge acknowledged the impact on Michael, praising his restraint during the incident and his grace afterward. He said Michael's statement reflected exemplary character and values. Then he turned to Karen's actions, speaking frankly about what they revealed. Her decision to cross the barrier showed disregard for rules. Her harassment showed disrespect for Michael's role in humanity. Her decision to strike him revealed an entitled belief that she could act without consequences. These were not momentary lapses, but deeply ingrained patterns of problematic behavior. However, the judge continued, he had also observed Karen's testimony and read Dr. Morrison's therapy reports. He reviewed documentation of her volunteer work and statements about her genuine engagement. He read letters she had written to her children and to Michael. While these positive steps didn't erase her actions, they suggested sincere efforts to change rather than simply avoiding punishment. The judge explained his reasoning carefully. He could impose maximum jail time, sending a strong message and satisfying public demand for accountability. But he questioned whether years in prison would produce the best outcome for society. Karen might emerge having paid her debt, but possibly hardened rather than improved. The opportunity for genuine transformation would likely be lost. A sentence focused on rehabilitation and community service could allow positive changes to continue while still holding her accountable. He was clear this was not about letting Karen off easy or suggesting privilege entitled her to special treatment. It was about choosing the form of justice that would produce the best outcome. Michael's own expression of hope for rehabilitation over punishment carried significant weight in his considerations. The judge announced his sentence. Karen would serve 6 months in jail, followed by 2 years of probation. During probation, she would complete 500 hours of community service, continue therapy, and participate in empathy-building programs. She was prohibited from leaving the country. Any violation would result in immediate maximum imprisonment. Additionally, Karen would pay a substantial fine to be donated to organizations supporting veterans and service members. She would also prepare and deliver a public service announcement about respecting service members and the consequences of entitled behavior. To be distributed to schools and community organizations, the judge addressed Karen directly, telling her she had been given an opportunity many wouldn't receive. Michael's grace and evidence of her genuine efforts had influenced his decision to focus on rehabilitation. But this opportunity came with responsibility. She needed to prove through sustained actions that her transformation was real and permanent. If she reverted to old patterns, she would face the full force of the law without mercy. Karen thanked the judge through her tears, promising to honor the opportunity and spend her life proving worthy of the mercy extended to her. As she was taken into custody, she caught Michael's eye and mouthed, "Thank you." Michael gave a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, recognition that they had both been changed by this experience. The 6 months in jail were difficult, but transformative. Karen was housed with women from all walks of life who had faced challenges she had never imagined. She listened to their stories and began understanding how privilege and opportunity shaped life outcomes. She made genuine friendships based on mutual respect rather than status or wealth. Karen read extensively about empathy, social justice, and systemic inequality. She wrote in her journal daily, processing what she learned and planning how to live differently. She maintained correspondence with Dr. Morrison, working through therapeutic exercises while incarcerated. She wrote regularly to Richard and her children, rebuilding those relationships. Richard visited every week, and Karen could see his confidence growing. He shared developments at home and how their community was reacting. Some people had written them off completely, unable to forgive the scandal. Others expressed support for her efforts to change. Michael continued his duties as a royal guard, but the incident had changed his perspective. He became involved in programs helping guardsmen deal with difficult tourist interactions. He shared his experience and emphasized the importance of maintaining professionalism while recognizing they deserved respect and support when faced with inappropriate behavior. The viral video remained online, but was increasingly accompanied by follow-up stories about the trial, sentencing, and Karen's journey toward change. Public opinion remained divided. Some felt she deserved harsher punishment and viewed mercy as evidence of privilege. Others saw the case as an example of justice, balancing accountability with opportunity for redemption. When Karen was released after 6 months, Richard, Jason, and Amy met her. The reunion was emotional and healing. Her children told her they were proud of her work and cautiously optimistic. They admitted they weren't ready to forget everything, but were willing to give her a chance to prove her. Transformation was real. Karen began probation and community service immediately. She worked at homeless shelters, food banks, and programs supporting families in poverty. She approached the work with humility and genuine desire to serve. The people she worked with taught her more than she could ever teach them. She created the court-ordered public service announcement, speaking directly to the camera about her experience. She told the story honestly, admitting her entitled behavior and the harm she caused. She emphasized that treating people with respect meant recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every human being. The video was distributed as ordered. Karen began receiving requests to speak in person at schools and organizations. She accepted cautiously, seeing them as opportunities to turn her worst moment into something that might help others avoid similar mistakes. 1 year after the incident, Karen received an unexpected letter from Michael. He wrote that he believed her transformation was genuine and had finally reached a place where he could offer forgiveness. He hoped they might meet someday to talk as two people who had shared a difficult experience and grown from it. Karen responded immediately, thanking him for his grace and expressing willingness to meet whenever he felt ready. Several months later, they met at a quiet cafe away from cameras. The conversation was initially awkward, but gradually they found common ground. They shared stories about how the incident had changed them both. As they parted, they shook hands with mutual respect. They weren't friends exactly, and the harm couldn't be completely erased. But they had found a way forward that honored both justice and mercy, accountability and redemption. Karen completed probation successfully and continued volunteer work long after required hours were finished. She became known not for the viral video of her worst moment, but for years of service and advocacy. The reaction she never saw coming after slapping the royal guard became the catalyst for becoming the person she should have been all along.